in our case, the land is a powerful part of the history of the education. And when you're there at Heart Mountain, it speaks to you. You're there under the shadow of what was sacred, what is a sacred place to the Crow Nation, Heart Mountain itself. You look out into the field, you can kind of imagine what it might have been like to come from Washington, Oregon, California, sunny, nice places, and then be brought into not only the barren landscape, but the harsh winter climate. So that whole history, that whole narrative is very telling to our educators and individuals who visit Heart Mountain just physically. And then what happens is, just like when you look at the soil, you know, the deeper you go into the soil, the more layers you uncover.
Well, we got to know that, you know, these were people who lived there for centuries before the white man ever appeared. They have their own history on this land, and it informs the history of the region and from the other people who live there. So we got to know that. We have to understand, you know, what they did there and why this land matters to them. And then we look at, you know, how they intersected with the other people who lived there later.
So the place itself is actually an incarceration site from 1942 to 1945. And but we also take into consideration of what this place was before it became an incarceration site, which that, of course, it was the ancestral lands of the Apsalica people, but also the Lakota, the Cheyenne, and many other Native American peoples.
This was the home of the Apsalica or Crow Nation up until really 1851, when the first Fort Laramie Treaty shrunk the size of their land and eventually forced them to move up to Montana.
And then over time, that Crow Nation and other nations got squeezed out. So by the 1870s, you have the Sioux and the Cheyenne nations, and they are the enemy then of the Crow Nation. And so those two come into conflict. And there's quite a play where the Crow Nation then sided with the US military. So it's Crow scouts with General Crook, with General Custer in 1876, as you get into the battles of the Rosebud and the Battle of Little Bighorn. Now that dynamic of who's on the side of the US government, who's opposed, why are they doing all those different relationships, what is happening, and just realizing how deep and how complex that is not unlike the experiences of Japanese Americans at Heart Mountain. And then on the other side of the mountain, of course, the Crow then in 1877 scout for the US military on the Nez Perce flight. And then in 1878, the Crow are the US scouts on the Bannock War. So in and around Heart Mountain itself, you have this link to three different wars in 3 different years, 1876, 1877, and 1888. And then environmentally, just kind of pulling back a little bit, you have this area being pretty devastated by the mountain men who kill the beaver, change the environment altogether, and basically take out those little ponds that the beaver had created and basically drain it, and it's all just brutal desert. So there's a lot of layers to the history that add to the complexity.
So when you're exploring this place where 14,000 Japanese Americans were incarcerated, you need to understand the history. And a huge part of that history involved the indigenous people who lived there before. And then you go from that to, you know, the appearance of white settlers in the 1800s, the lure of that area to Buffalo Bill Cody, the famous Western showman, and how he established an irrigation project to help feed the town that now bears his name. And it's that project that led the federal government to come in there and take it over. And that led to the irrigation systems that made Heart Mountain possible.
And of course, the way our story overlaps with that of Buffalo Bill is that the Japanese Americans incarcerated at Heart Mountain finished the irrigation project near the camp, near Heart Mountain Camp, as a way to irrigate the farm fields that were used to grow the produce necessary for the camps.
So this was land that was controlled by homesteaders and the federal government. And what made it appealing for the site of the Heart Mountain Camp was that it had railroad access. And that was something that Buffalo Bill helped bring in, in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And it had water, which was the result of the Shoshone irrigation project, which was an offshoot of what he had started, Buffalo Bill that is, had started in the early 1900s. Well, they dammed the Shoshone River, which was flowing east out of Yellowstone National Park. Then they created what's now this huge Buffalo Bill Reservoir that feeds water to a huge swath of northwestern Wyoming. That helped make it possible for people to start farms there, and this was all cemented by the 1902 Reclamation Act. And one of the side effects from this is we have people farming crops in areas that shouldn't have those crops because the soil isn't right. You see that certainly in Oregon and Northern California with the Klamath River and that reclamation project. You see it with the Buffalo Bill Dam. It drew a lot of white homesteaders to the region who weren't able to adapt to the kind of soil and conditions of the area. In a lot of ways, it kind of skewed the development and agricultural patterns of the region and other parts of the country.
Well, there's a lot of parallels between Japanese American history as well as the history of the local tribes at Heart Mountain. So on the West Coast, of course, during World War II, you start talking about what was the aftermath, what's the responses, what's the reaction to yellow peril, trying to take somebody's land, take somebody's resources. What went on there? How did that lead to constitutional infringements under Executive Order 9066? And then you come to Heart Mountain and you think, as you look out, whose land was this? Who was there? What sort of treaties might they have had?
So when the war ended and they closed the camp, the last day it was open was November 10th, 1945. The federal government sold all the barrack buildings to anyone who had $1 and the ability to haul it away. So the camp basically was carted away by trucks to various parts of Wyoming, Montana. You see these former barracks all over the place. So that made it easy for them to erase the camp. Then you had various homesteaders who after the war got plots of land, in that part of Wyoming. Some of them use those barracks as their homes and they remain their homes today.
So it also became, it's also part of their history as well, the homesteaders' history. And if you go today, if you go around Cody, you'll still see some of the barracks that have been converted into houses. So this place, that's just some of a little bit of histories that this place has witnessed.
So at Heart Mountain, the barracks are removed, even the cemetery graves are extracted and removed and sent away too. And so you almost have this feeling that history is being tried to wash away the history there at Heart Mountain and hide what really did happen. And so at Heart Mountain, what was left then for individuals traveling up and down the lone highway, perhaps on their way to Yellowstone, was a large smokestack that's still there. And that smokestack came to symbolize then that perhaps there was a deeper story, a deeper connection, and a deeper history at Heart Mountain than what was left by the landscape.